The night mercy was a crime. They threw me into a lion's cage for feeding a starving Apache child, and the crowd roared louder than the beast. That's how mercy became my crime in Willow Pass. The iron bars clanged behind me like a judge's gavel, and the heat of torchlight pressed against my skin as dozens of voices rose, not in pity, not in protest, but in savage delight. They did not come to see justice. They came to see me torn apart for daring to show kindness. The lion's growl rumbled low, its golden eyes catching the fire like molten coins. Yet what unsettled me more wasn't the animal, it was the people. They leaned forward with the same hunger, their laughter sharp as claws, their jeers louder than any roar inside that cage. In their eyes, I wasn't a man anymore. I was prey, and in that instant all my old silences came rushing back. The silence of cracked sidewalks I once walked alone as a child no family claimed. The silence of neon-lit diners where midnight coffee tasted like loneliness. The silence of unopened letters folded and abandoned because there was never anyone to send them to. Now that same silence pressed in again, broken only by their howls, reminding me of every scar carved by abandonment. The sheriff, Silas Crowder, strutted forward, his boots shining in the firelight, his voice dripping with smug righteousness. "Marcellus Boone," he announced, "you dared feed a filthy Apache. You dared to defy the law of Willow Pass, and now the law feeds you to the beast." His words struck harder than the shove that forced me to the bars. Kalen, the boy I had fed, stood beyond the crowd, small and trembling, his wide eyes searching for me. He was nothing but skin stretched over bones, his hunger as raw as his silence. Bread, that's all it had been. A single piece of bread. Yet in Willow Pass, that kindness carried a death sentence. Hiram Vale, owner of the menagerie, tipped his wide hat, playing ringmaster for the mob. "Ladies and gentlemen," he crowed, "tonight mercy pays its price." His voice rose like a carnival barker, as though my death were part of the show, a ticketed performance under his torchlit tent. The laughter that followed cut deeper than any blade. Faces blurred into a single sneering mask of cruelty, a mob whose joy was my humiliation. For a moment I wanted to vanish into the silence I had always carried. I wanted to close my eyes and disappear into the quiet where I had lived most of my life. But something inside me, fragile but alive, refused. A flicker of defiance, a whisper that maybe the real weakness wasn't mercy, it was cruelty. The deputies shoved me forward and the cage door slammed shut behind me. The lion lifted its head, its mane catching firelight, its body shifting with fluid menace. The crowd fell into an expectant hush, the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl because you know it isn't compassion. It's hunger waiting to be fed. My back pressed against the bars, the iron biting cold against my skin. The lion's breath carried the scent of raw meat and decay, heavy and suffocating. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, drowning out everything else. But then, through the blur of fire and faces, I saw him. At the edge of the torchlight, half-shadowed but unyielding, stood Thorne Ashfall. His stillness was unnatural in the chaos, his silence deliberate. He wasn't like the others. He didn't jeer, didn't mock, didn't thirst for blood. His eyes, dark, sharp, and steady, met mine, and in that instant something impossible passed between us. Recognition. It wasn't the recognition of friendship nor pity, but something older, deeper. The kind you feel when you look into a mirror and see scars that match your own. His gaze was not that of a spectator. It was the gaze of someone who understood survival, who had walked through his own cages, his own flames. The lion stepped closer, straw crunching beneath its paws, muscles rippling like coiled rope. Its growl deepened, a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. My chest tightened, breath catching. I could feel its heat now, smell the blood that clung to its teeth. The crowd began to chant, voices rising in unison. Do it! Do it! Their faces twisted, their mouths open wide, their laughter colliding with the lion's growl until cruelty and nature became one terrible sound. I thought of every night I had sat in diners alone, tracing cracks in the linoleum, convincing myself that loneliness was safer than attachment. I thought of walking through alleys lit by flickering street lamps, each shadow a reminder that I was unseen, unchosen. And now here in Willow Pass, those same shadows had followed me into the cage, pressing close, whispering that perhaps this was the ending I had always been headed toward. Yet I couldn't look away from Thorne Ashfall. His eyes didn't waver. His stance didn't falter. He wasn't smiling, wasn't afraid. He was waiting. For what, I didn't know. But in that waiting, I felt a strange calm seep through me. The lion's tail lashed, dust rising in the straw. Its muscles bunched as it crouched, preparing to strike. My palms bled where my nails dug into them, every muscle screaming to run, though there was nowhere to go. And then I heard it, a whisper. Not from the crowd, not from the sheriff, but from the shadows, carried like smoke through the noise. When I move, breathe. The words weren't loud, but they cut through the chaos as if they had been shouted. My eyes darted to Thorne. His lips hadn't moved, yet I knew it was him. For the first time, I felt that maybe I wasn't alone, that maybe the silence I had lived in wasn't permanent, that maybe, just maybe, someone else had already chosen a different ending for me. The lion shifted closer, the bars of the cage rattling with its weight. The crowd surged forward, breathless, eager for the final act. Sheriff Crowder smiled, satisfied. Mercy had been condemned and cruelty was about to be crowned. But mercy does not die so easily. And as the beast's shadow loomed larger, as the mob leaned in for blood, I saw Thorne Ashfall move, not toward the exit, not away from danger, but toward me. His presence cut sharper than any roar, a promise in motion. And in that final moment, with the lion's eyes fixed on mine and the crowd's laughter swallowing the night, I knew one truth that steadied my shaking bones. I thought I'd die in that cage, but someone else had already chosen otherwise. Eyes in the crowd, fire in the cage. The lion's paw struck the bars, iron shuddering like thunder, and the crowd screamed, not in fear but in delight. I flinched back, spine biting against the cage, every instinct screaming that this was the end. Yet even through the blur of firelight and jeering mouths, I could feel his gaze. Thorne Ashfall. He hadn't moved, hadn't flinched, but his presence was heavier than the beast's roar. I clung to that stillness the way a drowning man clings to driftwood. The lion prowled, its shoulders rippling with power, eyes burning gold as if they saw through flesh into bone. The air reeked of straw, blood, and anticipation. I could hear the rattle of chains, the squeak of iron hinges, the hiss of torches held too close to the bars. The whole world had shrunk to a circle of firelight, a cage of laughter, and one animal waiting for me to falter. Sheriff Silas Crowder's voice boomed like a judge pronouncing sentence. "This is what comes of feeding savages." His words sent another ripple of laughter through the crowd, their cruelty sharpened by his authority. I pressed back harder into the bars, wishing I could melt into them, disappear into the silence I'd always known. But then the lion lowered its body, haunches coiled, ready to strike. And in the second before it moved, I saw him again. Thorne. His lips were still, but his eyes carried words I could almost hear. "When I move, breathe." The beast lunged, I dove sideways, straw biting into my hands, iron bars grazing my shoulder as claws ripped through the space I had just been. The sound of the crowd's howl was deafening. Half laughter, half fury that I had dared to survive one more breath. The lion wheeled, tail slashing, jaws snapping inches from my arm. I scrambled back, chest heaving, every scar of my life screaming that this was where it all ended. But then, through the bars, I caught sight of something impossible. A mirror nailed to one of the support beams of the tent, warped from age but catching the firelight. And in that reflection I saw myself, not the man they mocked, not the prey they jeered at, but something rawer. My eyes weren't pleading, they were defiant. Broken, yes. Scarred, yes, but still alive. The lion lunged again, its claws raking the straw. I staggered, barely avoiding its weight, my breath tearing through my chest like glass. The crowd roared with each movement, chanting, demanding blood. And still, Thorne Ashfall did not look away. I remembered then the boy, Kalen, his small hands reaching for bread, his silence deeper than any hunger. In his eyes I had seen myself, the foster child left in doorways, the boy no one wanted, the man who had carried that abandonment like a second skin. Feeding him had not been rebellion. It had been recognition, and perhaps that was why Thorne watched me now. Not as stranger, but as someone who understood the weight of scars. The lion struck again, its paw slamming against the bars so close that sparks of rust flew. My body shook with exhaustion, fear threatening to unmake me. The crowd's laughter echoed like voices in an empty diner at midnight, cruel in their joy. "Finish it," someone screamed. The sheriff smirked. "The beast knows what to do." But then, the cage rattled, not from the lion's paw, from something else. A seam in the lock trembled as if touched by unseen hands. My eyes flicked toward Thorne. He was closer now, his body angled just enough that I realized the truth. He wasn't here as a spectator. He was here as a storm waiting to break. The lion crouched, tail twitching, the air thick with finality. My chest burned, my knees buckled, and for a second I thought I'd collapse. But then Thorne's eyes caught mine again. And this time, they didn't whisper. They commanded, "Breathe." So I did. The lion sprang. I threw myself sideways, rolling in the straw, the beast slamming into the bars with a thunderous crack. The crowd shrieked, part thrill, part shock. And in that chaos, the lock on the cage gave the faintest creak, a sound so small it might have gone unnoticed except to me. I froze, my breath caught. Because in that sound I knew I wasn't the only one fighting for air tonight. Someone else had chosen to fight for me. The crowd pressed closer, some standing on tiptoe, some climbing the wooden beams for a better view. Their shadows warped across the canvas, monstrous shapes that looked more beast than human. And I thought then, the lion wasn't the predator. They were. My chest heaved, sweat stinging my eyes, my hands trembling with the certainty of death. And yet, I could not look away from Thorne Ashfall. His presence was the only anchor in the madness, the only thing keeping me from collapsing into fear. The lion snarled, pacing again, its hunger insatiable. But even as it circled, even as the crowd chanted for blood, I felt something shift inside me. A fragile truth born of scars and silence. Maybe I wasn't meant to die here. Maybe the story wasn't ending. It was just beginning. The sheriff raised his hand to silence the crowd, his grin sharp as broken glass. "One more lunge," he declared, "and the mercy-loving fool will be no more." The lion crouched again, ready to strike. The crowd held its breath. My heart pounded like war drums in my chest, and then I heard it. Clear, low, unmistakable. A whisper carried across firelight and fury. Hold, the moment is near. It was him, Thorne, and with those words the cage no longer felt like my tomb. It felt like the waiting ground of something far greater. The lion moved, the crowd screamed, and in that instant I knew the night wasn't mine to end. Not yet. Willow Pass drinks blood for sport. Willow Pass cruelty wasn't hidden, it was advertised. It lived on posters nailed to rotting fence posts, in the carnival cries of Hiram Vale's menagerie, in the sly whispers traded like currency in every tavern. It wasn't enough for people to punish kindness. They had to sell tickets for it, to make humiliation a form of entertainment. And that night, with the lion's growl circling me like smoke, I learned what it meant to be consumed not just by a beast, but by an entire town's hunger for blood. The lion prowled, its shadow swelling large against the canvas walls, but it was the voices outside that made my stomach twist. Each laugh was sharper than claws, each jeer heavier than the bars pressing into my back. I had thought loneliness in neon-lit diners was unbearable, but this was worse. Loneliness magnified turned into spectacle. My shame wasn't private anymore. It was paraded, mocked, celebrated. Somewhere beyond the crush of bodies I heard her voice, Isolde Crane, the gossip engine of Willow Pass. Her tone was soft, but it carried like poison, weaving through the crowd, feeding them morsels of story as if they were starving dogs. "One crime man," she said with relish. "Marcellus Boone, the fool who fed an Apache child. And look where kindness got him. Not even the lions pity him." Her words burned hotter than the torches, because she wasn't just gossiping. She was rewriting me, turning me into a caricature to feed their cruelty. The boy I had tried to help, Kalen, faded from the story. Mercy faded from the story. All that remained was a punchline. The man too weak, too naive, too broken to know better. And as her whispers spread, others took them up, reshaping them, sharpening them. Laughter became legend in real time, and I was the corpse still breathing inside it. Then from the shadows of the crowd, another figure leaned close to Sheriff Crowder, Varick Holt, a man whose fortune had always been built on cruelty disguised as business. His voice was low, serpentine, meant to be overheard only by those it benefited. "The crowd grows fat on this," he murmured. "Imagine if we sell another night of it, not just a spectacle but a cycle. Your justice becomes profit, my coffers swell, and the people will beg for more." Crowder's smile widened. He wasn't just condemning me. He was franchising me. My shame would not end with death. It would repeat, multiply, sold and repackaged until it became the very blood sport that gave this town its heartbeat. The lion slammed against the bars, a growl vibrating the iron. My knees buckled, straw clung to sweat on my skin, but worse than the beast's breath was the truth pressing down on me. They didn't want me dead fast. They wanted me broken slow. The crowd shouted, demanded, leaned in. For them, this wasn't punishment, it was theater. And in that moment, I realized the bars around me weren't the only cage. The entire town of Willow Pass lived in one, shackled by its addiction to cruelty. They thrived on blood because it kept them from looking at their own emptiness. I knew emptiness. I had walked its streets as a boy, felt it in the silence of unopened letters, tasted it in cheap coffee at 2 a.m. But Willow Pass didn't sit with its silence. They drowned it in laughter at someone else's suffering. My chest heaved, shame boiling hotter than fear. Death didn't terrify me as much as their delight did, because fear was mine, but shame. Shame belonged to them, and they were feeding on it like wolves. And yet through it all, there was still him, Thorne Ashfall. Closer now, though he had not announced himself. His presence slid forward like a shadow untethered, unnoticed by the mob drunk on cruelty. He was silent, yes, but his silence wasn't absence. It was command. He stood not as a man watching, but as a man waiting, coiled like an arrow, notched but unloosed. His gaze locked on me, unwavering, a tether across firelight. I tried to hold it, to believe in it, though my knees shook and my lungs clawed for air. Because in his eyes I saw something I had never known. Not pity, not mockery, but recognition. He saw the bruised past beneath my skin, the scars carved by abandonment, the loneliness that shaped me into someone they could laugh at. And in seeing it, he did what no one in Willow Pass had done before. He acknowledged it. The lion's growl deepened, its patience thinning. The crowd roared again, the chant rising, "Blood! Blood! Blood!" The cage shuddered as the beast pressed against it, muscles twitching, claws raking sparks. Crowder lifted his hand, his voice thick with triumph. "Justice is a lion, and tonight mercy is its meal." The mob screamed approval. Isolde whispered faster, Varric smiled wider, and I felt myself shrinking smaller, swallowed whole by their joy. But then, through the madness, a sound reached me. Not from the lion, not from the crowd, a whisper soft as ash falling through night. When I move, breathe. My heart stopped. My eyes darted to Thorne. His lips had not moved, but I knew it was him. The promise I had clung to in Chapter 2 had returned, sharper now, undeniable. It was the first time in my life that silence felt like salvation. And in that moment I understood something. The lion wasn't the only thing about to strike. The first break in the bars, lions don't choose their cages. The lion's eyes looked less hungry than the men outside the bars. Its golden gaze tracked me with the patient rhythm of a predator, but it was the crowd whose mouths were open wider, whose hunger dripped louder than any growl. Their eyes gleamed in the firelight, greedy for my ruin. I realized then the beast inside the cage was not the one with claws and teeth. It was the mob beyond the bars. The lion's chest rose and fell, its tail swishing against the straw, but there was no malice in its stare. Only nature. Only survival. The men outside, though, they were not surviving. They were feasting. On shame. On fear. On the spectacle of my undoing. It hit me with a coldness sharper than any claw. I wasn't trapped with the lion. The lion was trapped with me, both of us pawns in their theater. Neither of us had chosen this cage. Sheriff Silas Crowder strutted before the crowd, one hand resting proud on the butt of his revolver. His voice was slick with self-righteousness, but behind his smirk I saw the truth. He wasn't feeding me to the lion for justice. He was feeding the town's appetite for cruelty. "This," he declared, "is what comes of mercy. Let it be a lesson." A ripple of laughter spread through the mob. Isolde Crane's whisper darted from one ear to another, painting me as the fool of the year. "The one crime man," she hissed, turning my act of bread into legend for their mockery. Varric Holt leaned in near the sheriff, his grin snake-like. "Crowder, keep this up and Willow Pass will never thirst for gold. They'll pay to watch every fragile mercy be devoured." Their words burned deeper than the lion's breath warming the air. My legs trembled not from the beast's nearness but from the weight of their scorn. Shame burned deeper than fear. I wanted to vanish into silence. The same silence that had followed me through every cracked sidewalk I had walked as a child with no hand to hold. Silence had been my cage long before these bars, my constant companion in diners where I traced the grooves of tables alone. where coffee cooled in cups untouched by company. That silence pressed in again now, heavy and suffocating. But then, through the roar of the mob, I noticed something shifting at the edge of the torchlight. Thorne Ashfall. He wasn't standing still anymore. His body moved with subtlety, deliberate and precise, as if he were part of the shadows themselves. His hands brushed against the seams of the menagerie's canvas walls, loosening ties, testing weak points. No one saw it. No one but me. And in that hidden motion I felt a surge of air in my lungs. He wasn't a spectator. He was an architect of something I couldn't yet name. The lion stepped forward, closer now, its mane brushing the bars, its breath heavy with the stench of meat. My knees weakened, my chest ached, and inside a question gnawed. Was mercy worth dying for? Feeding Kaelin had felt like instinct, not rebellion. A starving child's eyes had mirrored mine, a boy abandoned, a boy unseen. Bread had been a bridge between us, a fragile proof that loneliness doesn't always have to mean emptiness. But now that bridge was burning, and I was the kindling. The crowd surged, faces glowing with firelight, voices colliding into a single howl. They were drunk on my downfall, feeding their hollow lives with my humiliation. And I realized with a sickening clarity that cruelty was their opiate. Mercy wasn't weakness. It was rebellion. The lion crouched low, muscles tightening, eyes locked on me. My palms bled from my nails, digging deep. I wanted to scream, to curse them all, but my throat was stone. And yet, I felt it again. That tether. Thorne's eyes locked on mine, steady and deliberate. He didn't smile. He didn't flinch. He simply watched, and in that watching was command. Breathe, his gaze seemed to say. Hold. The mob stomped their boots, the canvas quaked with their fervor, and the sheriff lifted his hand, ready to let the beast decide my fate. And then it happened. The lock on the cage rattled, not from the lion's weight, not from my trembling, but on its own, like something unseen had reached inside and touched it. The sound was faint, metallic, out of place in the chaos, but I heard it. My heart seized, my breath caught. The lion froze, ears twitching as if it too had sensed the shift. The crowd laughed louder, mistaking the pause for drama, but I knew something was about to break. Blood paid for mercy. The first blood spilled was not mine. It was his. The handler stumbled over a rope left coiled too close to the cage, and the trap line Thorne had set snapped taut like a gunshot. The torch in the man's hand flared wild, dropping into the straw. The lion roared, the sound splitting the air like an earthquake, and the crowd erupted into chaos. I staggered back, heart pounding, every bone braced for the beast's claws. But before the lion could lunge, before my breath could even catch, the bars tore open with a scream of metal. Thorne Ashfall. His hand was bloodied, the steel bent under his force, his body a wall between me and the beast. In that single moment, the Apache warrior stepped into my cage as if it had always been his fight. He didn't hesitate, he didn't pause. He shouldered me back, his voice low but sharp as flint. Move, I stumbled, half in shock, half in awe, and then I saw it, the gash across his forearm, crimson spilling quick, staining the straw beneath him. The first blood of the night wasn't mine, it was his, paid for mercy I had thought belonged to me alone. The lion lunged, claws raking air where we had stood a breath before, but Thorne's stance never faltered. He shoved me toward the seam in the canvas, his own body angling to absorb what the beast or the mob would give. I wanted to protest, to tell him it wasn't his fight, but the words died on my tongue. 'Cause in his silence I felt something deeper than language. Recognition. All my life I had been the boy no one shielded. In foster rooms where my name was a number, in sidewalks where my shadow walked alone, in diners where the coffee went cold across from an empty chair. No one had ever stood between me and the world's cruelty, until now. And in that instant, shame burned out of me and something new took its place. Trust. The canvas ripped. Torches swung wild. The crowd screamed, half in terror, half in rage. What had been entertainment had turned into rebellion, and they didn't know who to cheer for anymore. Sheriff Crowder's voice thundered over the chaos. "Shoot the Apache!" The order cracked like a whip, snapping the crowd's frenzy into focus. Deputies shoved through, rifles raised, torches flaring against the night. Their eyes burned not with justice but with fear, the kind of fear that lashes out to protect its own power. Thorne's hand pressed against his wound, blood still streaming, but his gaze never wavered. He looked at me once, steady, unwavering, commanding the same breath he had demanded before. His silence wasn't absence. It was intimacy. It was faith that I would hear without sound. The lion roared again, the bars shuddering as if the world itself was trying to break apart. My chest heaved, torn between terror and awe, my mind clawing at the truth. Mercy had not just condemned me. Mercy had bound me to him, and in that moment, standing in a storm of firelight, rifles, and blood, I realized that freedom was never free. It was bought, paid for in scars, in silence, in blood not always our own. The deputies cocked their rifles, the torches arced higher, and I knew the next second would decide everything. The question wasn't whether I would survive. The question was whether mercy itself would. The midnight of betrayal, running the shadows of Willow Pass. We weren't running from lions. We were running from the lie they lived by. The lie said cruelty was justice and mercy was a crime, that a town could sell humiliation as entertainment and sleep easy under its own applause. The lie had teeth sharper than the lion's and a hunger that never tired. It wore a badge and a top hat and a smile that charged admission, and it roared through the voices of neighbors who mistook their emptiness for righteousness. We ran because once the lie decides you're its lesson, it will grind you down until memory forgets your name. Thorne Ashfall didn't run so much as redraw the world beneath our feet. One heartbeat. I was a man trapped in a cage of iron and laughter. The next I was clawing through a slit in the canvas with straw stuck to my palms and smoke scalding my throat while the menagerie buckled behind us like a collapsing stage set. His blood traced a dark ribbon down his forearm, but his movements stayed exact. Each step a decision that had been measured before it was taken. "Down," he said without looking back. And I obeyed, because the only breath I trusted in that moment was the one he allowed me to take. We slid into the seam between tents and fence rails, a corridor of dust and forgotten rope where sound folded in on itself. Behind us, the crowd broke from laughter to panic, a single creature rearing up on its hind legs. Sheriff Crowder's order cut the night. "Shoot the Apache," and torches surged with the thrill of licensed violence. The lion roared again, but distance turned it into a memory the land would keep without needing us. In front of me, a small shape moved, fragile and fast. Kalen, the boy whose hunger had been my only rebellion. He ran bent low, silent as if silence had been taught to him before language. One hand out to feel the boards, the other clenched at his chest as if holding the last warm thing he owned. We hit the alley that split Willow Pass like a scar no one ever tended. Fence pickets listing drunkenly, wash lines shivering with the heat of nearby fire. The street lamps along the main road threw their weak halos like tired saints. Here in the back lanes, light arrived late and left early. Thorne raised 2 fingers and angled his wrist. I had no training for such signals, yet my feet understood what my mind didn't. Left at the empty crate, still at the tore-up barrel hoop, low past the broken shutter where laughter had always sounded thickest on summer nights. In that choreography, his silence wasn't distance. It was presence. You could step inside. Kalen stumbled. Instinct moved faster than thought. I scooped him under his arms, and he latched to my shirt with the desperate faith of someone who has learned that falling means disappearing. He was heat and bone and tremor, a mirror I had avoided all my life. I could feel my own childhood reaching toward me from the bottom of a stairwell where no one ever climbed back down to see if I was still there. From the booth in a diner where the coffee cooled across from an empty chair. From letters folded 3 times and hidden beneath floorboards because no address was safe enough to trust with the truth. When he buried his face against me, I understood I hadn't fed him to save him. I had fed him to recognize myself. Gunmetal cracked. A bullet chewed bark from the fence post 2 steps above my shoulder. Thorne didn't flinch. He simply changed time. He caught my sleeve and pulled me through a breath so thin it felt like the space between pages, and then we were inside the back lot of the feed store. Salt sacks stacked like pale sleeping animals, pitchfork handles rising in a thorny thicket. He tore a scrap of burlap with his teeth, wrapped it around his bleeding arm, and tied the knot with one hand in a motion so practiced it might have been a prayer he had said too many times. "Why?" I rasped, the question breaking from a place I used to keep locked. "Why step into another man's cage? Why cut your skin on my chains? Why choose my breath over your own?" His eyes found mine, dark and unblinking. "Because they teach boys like him to starve," he said, and the words entered me like a nail driven true, not a speech, not a promise, an accounting. We moved again, the alley narrowing, the fences leaning in like eavesdroppers. The town's front, all clapboard smiles and painted signs, lay a block away. Here behind it sat the truth. Piles of broken crates, a wheel with no axle, a door with no handle. We slid through that truth with the intimacy of thieves reclaiming what had been stolen from them. Kalen clung to me, making no sound. Thorne's hand brushed the boards as we passed. He dragged 2 fingers along the grain, and I realized he was reading, drawing a map from the story the wood told about who had leaned here and when, which boot scraped, which nail pulled, how often the hinge was oiled. He didn't move through town. He let town confess. We crossed the lip of Maine where the street lamps learned how to be light from a preacher who had run out of sermon. The diner's neon flickered in wan gusts, casting a feverish blush on the windows. I saw us in the glass, 3 figures stacked in a crooked mirror. A man whose name the town had turned into a joke, a boy who had learned to hold himself small, and a warrior who had made a discipline out of silence. For the length of a heartbeat, I saw a 4th figure layered behind us. That other life I had always promised I would begin when the money was right, and the weather was fair, and the past agreed to behave. The reflection rocked, fragile as a card house. And then the light stuttered and our ghosts slid away. Outside the diner door, a placard hung crooked, last week's special scribbled half over, chicken fried absolution, 2 eggs of easy forgiveness. Inside, a woman wiped a counter that did not get clean. I felt the old ache of wanting to enter that yellow light and sit down like I belonged to something warm and ordinary. Thorne's shoulder touched mine, barely, and the ache let go. Warm and ordinary would kill us. We needed sharp and true. We cut across the alley toward the livery where the street dropped into a shallow run of mud that never fully dried. The smell of ammonia and iron rose like a memory of bodily fear. Over the stables, the big house on the hill shone with too many lamps, the windows pretending to be moons. People called it the Overlook, but to me it looked like every penthouse window I had ever stared at from a street where luxury cars glided like polished lies. A curated emptiness with a good view. Tonight those windows watched the menagerie burn and learned nothing. A bell rang 2 streets over, small, insistent. The Clinic of Second Chances kept its lamp all night, a square of honey at the end of an otherwise bitter block. I had stood outside its door more than once, counting my breaths to see if they could make currency. I had left every time, hoarding my shame like a treasure only I recognized. Now as we slipped past the alley that led to its stoop, I thought of the ledger in its desk, names sewn like broken buttons into the book's tired cloth. And I knew that if I walked through that door after tonight, my signature would not be a plea. It would be a witness. Left, Thorne murmured, and the word folded around us more like a shape than a sound. We moved into the space between the blacksmith and the undertaker, where metal and wood argued quietly about what lasts longer. Kalen lifted his head. His eyes asked nothing, but I answered anyway. "You're not alone," I told him without voice, the sentence resting in the spot between his shoulder blades and my ribs. He relaxed by the measure of a bird's breath, which is to say hardly at all and exactly enough. Boots hammered somewhere behind us, rhythm tightening, deputies flowing into a single intent. Sheriff Crowder's command carried on the air, thinner now but more poisonous for the distance. "You bring me his body or you bring me your badge." The lie was starving. It would eat uniforms to keep its diet. Thorne stopped suddenly, palm lifted. Ahead, moonlight lapped at the corner of a fence where boards had been propped into a shabby gate. He crouched, touched the ground, then the bottom rail, then pointed to a vacancy between slats where someone slim could slide. He looked at Kalen and then at me, and in his eyes I saw the equation. Smallest first, then the man who needed more time to learn obedience. I set the boy down. He went knife-like through the gap without complaint. My shoulders fought the wood until Thorne's hand found the board that needed forgiving, and the board forgave. We were through. The 3 of us, a single discomforting shadow moving over the backyards of men who would have sworn their fences meant something. A dog barked once and changed its mind. A woman closed a shade softly, not to hide from us, but to hide the way she wanted us not to be hurt. The night had begun to learn different sentences. We came to a dead end that wasn't. A stack of crates climbed halfway up a brick wall, and above that a clothesline sagged between buildings like a rope waiting to become a bridge. Thorne tested each crate with a knee, then a heel. He was listening for the sound a lie makes when it's dressed as wood. He went up, hand over hand, light as if he'd left weight behind on purpose. Kalen followed like a thought you didn't realize you'd been having until it reached the top of the page. I climbed last, poorer at grace but richer in want. On the roof the world opened, a low sea of shingles and smoke, the menagerie's canvas sinking in dull waves. From here, Willow Pass looked almost beautiful, the way a face looks like hymnals in candlelight when you don't know the hymn. Thorne scanned, found a run of roof lines that would carry us to the freight lane. I put my palm to my chest and felt the folded paper there. The letter of truth I had written in the hour I believed the night might erase me. It beat against my ribs like a small creature that wanted out. "Not yet," I told it. "Not until a place exists where words can stand without being mocked for trying." We descended behind the saddle shop into a yard littered with leather scraps and curved needles Moons had lost. The air sharpened. Somewhere a rifle bolt slid, a metallic inhale you cannot mistake. Thorne's head tilted. His eyes asked the night to admit where the danger sat. The night obliged. A glint low and right beyond the stacked barrels near the mouth of the next alley. He motioned us left into a narrow slit where Brick remembered how men cooled themselves at noon before they started another day of pretending. We entered it single file, Thorne first, then Kaelin, then me, shoulders kissing stone, breath thin to a thread. A window rode high on the wall, a square of glass blurred with grime. I glanced up and caught a ghost of our procession. 3 figures stretched and elongated into something tender by the distortion. It looked like a family if you didn't know better. I let the lie comfort me for exactly 1 step and then put it down. Love that defies fairy tales is still love. It just refuses to pretend that rescue is romance. The alley opened into a tiny court where the earth had forgotten to declare ownership. We might have crossed it clean if fate hadn't remembered it was a participant. A crate, the sort that waits years to matter, shifted as Kaelin brushed it. The nail that held it announced its fatigue with a pop, and the crate toppled just enough to shout. The shout went everywhere. So did light. Torches flared at the far end, their orange tongues painting the brick in verdicts. Boots parted from shadow. Figures first, then faces, then the expression money wears when it knows its investments are coming due. Varric Holt stepped into the mouth of the court with the leisure of a man arriving at his own porch. The pistol already risen to the height where decisions don't have to shout to be obeyed. The barrel found us as easily as a rumor finds a hungry ear. His smile was tidy, his coat unwrinkled, his hair a sermon on the power of private water. Behind him, 2 deputies set their sights with the solemnity of men practicing grief. "Evening," Varric said, and the word felt like a gloved hand patting a fresh grave. "The town appreciates efficiency." "I do most of all," Thorne's shoulders lowered by the width of a silent oath. My grip tightened around Kaelin until I felt his breath press small and sure against my wrist. The clinic lamp 2 streets over held its square of honey as if to say there were still sentences that could be written without blood. The letter in my pocket beat again. Varric cocked the pistol, the sound precise as a nail finding oak. "Here's how this ends," he murmured, and the torches leaned in to bless him, and the night drew its own breath to hear the terms. He lifted the barrel until it pointed at the space between us where choice lives, and the alley closed like a throat, and for 1 stretched thin second I felt all my afterlives standing in a row waiting to be assigned. Then he smiled the way rich men smile when they're about to take something they will later call inevitable. And he stepped fully into the passage, blocking it with his body and his gun and his tidy certainty. And there was nowhere left to go but through him. The names they feared in silence. When he spoke his name, the fire in the square seemed to bow. It wasn't a shout, not a threat, not even a speech, just the simple iron of truth introduced into air fattened with lies. "Thorne Ashfall," he said, and the torch nearest Varric Holt shivered as if a breeze had found it in a night without wind. The deputies who had shouldered their rifles to deliver me back into the lion's den of Willow Pass stopped just shy of aiming, their bodies remembering something their mouths had forgotten. Once this name had carried them through a piece of darkness they still haven't been brave enough to name. I had expected bravado, the sort of heroics the men in this town purchase with whiskey and rehearse to their sons when the lamps are low. I got none of that. Thorne said the words the way a river introduces itself to a stone. Constant, level, without apology. The crowd's noise, not quite a mob anymore, not yet a congregation, tilted on its axis. Silas Crowder held his posture with the stiffness of a man surprised in his own uniform. Varric's tidy smile trembled, then restored itself with the discipline of money. "This isn't your ground," Varric said, pistol steady, eyes calculating a price for the distance between us. "Nor your story." "It is," Thorne answered, and the quiet after that agreement drew the torches closer as if fire itself craved the correction of memory. "Because the last time you lit this square, your flames were not for justice. They were for a ledger." The word ledger moved through the bodies gathered there like a draft through a room sealed for winter. I felt it comb my spine and unthread the tight knot of humiliation that had held me since they threw me into a lion's cage for feeding a starving Apache child. Ledger. A town like ours does not fear teeth. It fears a record of itself that cannot be laughed away. Crowder's voice cracked. Not loudly, but along a line the ear recognizes as the beginning of a collapse. "You're a trespasser who incites memory," Thorne said, finishing the sentence with a patience that made the sheriff's badge look like a paper sun pinned to a child's drawing. "You know my name because you called it once when the winter river climbed its banks and the road you sold men as a shortcut turned into a grave. You hired me to walk the crossing. You told those men speed would save their wagons, and I told them patience would save their children. Half believed you. Half believed me. The river kept the ones who trusted gold to weigh more than breath." He did not raise his voice when he added, "I brought out the children. I brought out 3 men who admitted they did not know the water. You called me thief because your cargo went under, and you learned then what you always fear, that there is a strength you cannot hire." The torches hissed like creatures told to sit. I watched Crowder's jaw flex, Varric's fingers adjust on the pistol, the deputies recalibrate the shape of their courage. Around us, the square performed its evening rituals. Door latches clicked. A chair scraped in the diner. The street light at the corner coughed itself brighter, then dimmer, then decided to watch from half-wakefulness like a tired saint. Through the diner window I caught our reflection, warped by glass and steam. 3 figures stitched together by circumstance. The Apache warrior whose name the fire remembered. The boy Kalen, silent in my arms the way hunger teaches silence before language. And me, Marcellus Boone, the one crime man they had advertised as a spectacle until the spectacle grew teeth they did not own. Varric's voice softened the way ice smooths a blade. "You ruined a crossing that put Willow Pass on maps that matter. Men died because you meddled. Do not feed us virtue and call it bread." Thorne didn't blink. "Men died because you timed the river by your pocket watch. I told you the water keeps its own clocks. You hired riders to punish me for the lesson. They found my camp and took nothing because there is nothing in my camp a ledger knows how to count." He glanced once at Crowder's hand on the holster. "You fear wolves and lions, Sheriff, but what your town fears most is that mercy remembers." The word mercy struck me like a match in a room thick with the smell of damp wood and old coffee. I had believed the criminal thing I did was hand a child bread. Listening to Thorne, I understood the criminal thing I would have done was to walk past that hunger and call it prudence. The square smelled of animal and rope and sweat and smoke. Somewhere behind us the menagerie canvas sighed as its seams gave up. Above us the overlook, Willow Pass's imitation moon, That big house stuffed with purchased light, watched with windows that never learned how to look ashamed. Silas Crowder recovered a little of his theater. He fed a trespasser, he said, stabbing his finger toward me and toward Kalen with the same gesture a man uses when he points at a stain and calls it proof. He defied the law. My law, I said, and the fact that my voice held steady surprised me less than the fact that the square listened. The only law I've ever trusted is the one that keeps a boy from starving to death within sight of bread. I didn't feed him to defy you. I fed him to survive myself. The words surprised me as they arrived. Sentences I had written once in the letter of truth I carry against my ribs. Now stepping into air I had always thought too hostile to hold them. Because once I was that boy. Because I have eaten the kind of loneliness that lives under neon in empty diners, and I have learned to drink the silence that lives in hallways where foster doors close and never open. And because every time I walked past a person who needed what I had, I learned again the lie you sell, that safety is purchased by looking away. I am done buying that. The crowd moved in a way that had nothing to do with feet. I saw faces shift, the woman who had wiped the diner counter until the rag found no more relief, the farmer whose hands had always looked like tools, the boy who had practiced cruelty because it was the only language his father praised. Isolde Crane stood at the edge of the circle. She had spent a lifetime tightening with her whispers. Her eyes were brighter than the torches, not with tears, not with triumph, but with the startled glint of a person who has heard a sentence she once said against someone else return to her wearing a different face. Strength, Thorne said, catching my confession and setting it down where the town could see it, does not live in muscle. It lives in memory. He lifted his bleeding arm. Bandage dark, fingers steady. Your men think strength is in the lift, in the strike, in the weight they can throw. But it is in the story you agree to carry. If your story is that a child must starve to keep your peace tidy, then your strength is paper. If your story is that mercy makes you weak, then your strength is noise. Memory carries a different math. It will walk a river in winter and wait there until the timing is right. It will stand between a lion and a man and lose blood to buy a breath. And it will do these things without the receipt you require. He spoke without heat, and the absence of heat made the words burn truer. I felt my own body answer them, not with applause, not with tears, but with a new kind of stillness. The silence presence between us, the bond we had not named, the unspoken connection that had begun as survival and grown into recognition, settled into my bones the way night settles onto a field that has decided not to fear darkness. This was not romance. This was not rescue tall-taled in a saloon. This was the quiet transformation that begins when you accept the cost of seeing. Varric's pistol never dipped, but I watched doubt needle his certainty. Fine words from a man who ruins enterprises, he said. But words don't pay. Men like me build towns. Men like you burn them. Thorne's eyes slid once to the clinic lamp 2 streets down, that small square of honey where second chances were measured not by eloquence but by showing up. What you build, he said, are cages. You sell the ticket that explains why the bars feel necessary. Tonight your own crowd learned what the bars are for. His gaze returned to me and to Kalen, and then to the ring of faces that had long decided it was easier to eat a man than to share a meal with him. Cages are a way to keep a memory from walking. Crowder opened his mouth to command something, arrest, volley, pretense that order could be reasserted by arrangement, but the deputies' bodies betrayed him. a pair of rifles lowered by a finger's width, enough to show that the men attached to them had decided their futures looked longer if this moment ended without another ledger entry written in blood. Around us, the town's heartbeat faltered toward thought. Isolde Crane moved. I don't know when she slipped through the bodies or from where she recovered the little ring of keys that made her fingers glitter like gossip in sunlight. But there she was near the freight gate, the iron lattice that kept the alleys from becoming exits when men like Varric preferred them to be traps. The keys hung from her index finger as lightly as rumor. She had built a life on handing people sentences that sentenced them. Now a line of metal hung between us like a question shaped to the size of a choice. Isolde, Varric said without turning his head, and the way he said her name contained all the years she had served as his wind. Be wise. Wisdom in Willow Pass had always meant obeying the lie. It meant calling cruelty prudence and naming it law. It meant letting a boy like Kalen learn hunger as grammar and adulthood as a series of doors closed in his face. It meant men like me writing letters of truth by lamplight and never mailing them because the address grief gave us was always returned to sender. Isolde stood at the overlap of all those addresses now, a woman whose tongue had once built cages suddenly holding the hinge that might make a door. I felt the old city in me, the one of cracked sidewalks and penthouse emptiness and luxury cars that glide past need as if it is a pothole for other tires. Breathe into this square made of dust and rope and tar. At the edge of my vision, the diner window made a mirror of night again, and in it I saw the three of us layered as before, warrior, child, fool turned witness. But this time there was a fourth figure threaded through, a woman with keys in her hand and a mouth that had finally run out of appetite for the sound of herself. "Let him go, Isolde," I said, surprising myself by using her name with no salt on it. "Let me learn what the clinic tried to teach me from the outside of its door. Let the boy learn that doors can swing both ways." Her eyes flicked to mine, then to Thorne's bleeding arm, then to Kalen's cheek where ash had settled like a bruise the world had not earned the right to put there. The square held its breath. Even the torches seemed to listen rather than burn. Varric changed tactics the way a card sharp folds a hand to keep the table from questioning the deck. "You owe stability your loyalty, Miss Crane," he said, the pistol unwavering. "You owe the town the story we can live with in the morning." "In the morning," Thorne said. "You owe yourselves a story you can live with at all." The sentence hung clean as laundry on a good wind. It was not noble. It was not purple. It was simply correct. I felt the letter of truth against my ribs press forward as if my chest were a door too. My hands were not empty, they held a child. My throat was not brave. It held a past. My future for once was not a speech. It was a path curved toward a woman with keys and a man with a name that turned fire humble. Isolde lifted the ring by a fraction. Her mouth opened, not wide, not yet, and the muscles in her throat taught themselves the first syllable of a sound that could be deliverance or alarm, depending on what her memory chose to call strength. Her fingers trembled so slightly the keys clinked with the soft apology chains make when they dream of becoming tools. Would she let the metal speak for her and slide it across the night into our hands? Or would she do what Willow Pass had trained her to do? Draw a breath bright with panic and scream a betrayal the town already knew by heart. The real den was not made of bars. It was built of their laughter. That was the first truth the fire taught me. The menagerie canvas split like skin, torches leaping in the wind, the iron cages groaning as if they had been waiting their whole lives for an excuse to collapse. Willow Pass scrambled, screaming now instead of howling, but the sound carried the same note, a town drunk on cruelty suddenly choking on the smoke of its own spectacle. Thorne Ashfall pulled me forward through the heat, his grip hard despite the blood darkening his bandaged arm. Kalen clung to my waist, his silence cutting sharper than any scream. Behind us, a lion bellowed once, not in hunger but in release, its massive shape tearing free of iron that had never deserved to contain it. Panic scattered the crowd. The laughter that had been so quick, so eager, curdled into terror. And in that sound I understood. The true cage was never mine. It had always been theirs. Their cruelty was the lock, their mockery the bars. We moved through the smoke toward the far row of wagons, and there I saw them, figures huddled in chains. Men and women, some Apache, some Pawnee, some faces I didn't recognize, all dragged from other towns to serve the traveling punishment Willow Pass had sold as justice. Their wrists gleamed with iron. Their eyes burned with the quiet fury of people told too many times that their lives were currency. I froze, not from fear but from recognition. These were not strangers, they were mirrors. Each chain a reflection of my own silence across years I had convinced myself were survival. Help them, I whispered, my voice trembling not from smoke but from shame. Thorne didn't argue. He knelt at the first shackle, his knife working with the precision of someone who had broken more locks than he had opened doors. The metal resisted, then gave, the sound sharp as bone cracking. One by one, the prisoners stepped into air that did not yet know how to hold them. Kalen moved among them, pressing his small hand to their wrists, his silence granting them something louder than words. Recognition. When my turn came, I tore at a lock with both hands until my palms split. The blood ran hot, slicking the rust. And for the first time, I did not think of survival as escape. I thought of survival as multiplication. One breath becoming two, two becoming 10. Each freed hand was a confession I had needed to speak all my life. Mercy is not weakness. It is rebellion. I rose, the fire at my back, the freed standing beside me, and the town pressed in, their torches bright with indecision. Sheriff Silas Crowder stood at their head, badge gleaming like a counterfeit sun. His voice tried to carry authority, but the edges frayed. This is disorder. This is anarchy. I met his eyes. My throat trembled, but my words held. No, this is mercy, and mercy is rebellion against the cage you sold us as law. The crowd shifted uneasily. Some lowered their torches. Others glanced at the freed, at Kalen, at Thorne standing tall despite the blood staining his shirt. In their faces I saw something unfamiliar, recognition. Not agreement yet, not courage, but the crack of a mirror that had once only reflected cruelty. Crowder's hand dropped to his revolver. His grip faltered. His mouth worked to summon another decree, but the words tangled. For the first time I realized he was afraid, not of lions, not of me, not even of Thorne, but of silence. Because silence meant the crowd was no longer certain. Silence meant memory had entered the square. I stepped closer, my chest heaving, my voice finding the strength memory lens. You told them mercy would make them weak. But look around, Sheriff. You're the one shaking. You built cages out of laughter because you feared the day it would stop. The torches wavered. Somewhere glass shattered. Whether from heat or hands, I could not tell. The night hung taut, trembling between two futures. And then, gunfire cracked. The world tilted in an instant. The sound tore through the square like a sentence no one wanted to hear. I saw the flash before I understood the target. Varric Holt, his pistol raised, his smile unbroken, had chosen his ledger's solution. But I did not fall. Thorne Ashfall stepped in front of me, his body a shield before I could even breathe. The bullet struck, his frame jolting, his blood spilling hotter than the fire behind us. He staggered, yet remained upright, his eyes finding mine not with fear, but with the certainty of a man who had already counted this cost. The crowd gasped. The freed cried out. Kalen clutched my leg, trembling. Sheriff Crowder froze halfway between order and surrender, his badge gleaming useless in the smoke. Thorne's voice, ragged but unbroken, cut through the silence that followed the gunshot. "Remember this," he whispered, "cages don't break us. They break the ones who build them." And then his knees bent, the weight of him pressing into my arms as the fire roared higher, and the night asked itself a question that no one dared answer yet. Would the crowd let the cage collapse, or rebuild it out of his blood? Ashes of Willow passed by dawn. The only thing left standing was silence. The menagerie was nothing but ash, the air thick with soot that clung to our throats and skin. The smell of burned canvas and charred iron hovered like a ghost, stubborn, unwilling to let the town pretend it hadn't feasted on cruelty only hours before. The square, once loud with laughter, howls, and jeers, now sat hushed, as if even the wind feared to speak the truth daylight revealed. I stood where the lion's cage had once been. Nothing remained but a skeleton of bars melted into black earth. The crowd had gone. Some back to their homes, some into hiding, some into prayers they had forgotten how to say. Willow Pass itself felt different, stripped. It was as if the town had burned too, not with flame, but with shame. And yet I could not escape the knowledge that my home was gone too. Not in fire. My shack on the outskirts still stood, though barely more than wood and shadow, but in meaning. A home is supposed to be safety, permanence, a place where the night can't reach. But my nights had always reached me. Foster homes where my name was a temporary entry on a form. Streets where cracked sidewalks whispered abandonment. Diners where silence was my companion. I had carried my scars into every threshold, and so had built no home that could keep them out. The ashes in the square were only a mirror of the ashes inside me. Thorne Ashfall stood apart, Kalen beside him, the boy's small hand tucked into his. Thorne's wound was bandaged now, his blood seeping through linen he refused to acknowledge. He bore it the way he bore every scar, with the resilience of someone who had long ago accepted pain as currency. I wanted to thank him. I wanted to confess that my survival was not mine, but his. But the words tangled into shame. Gratitude without power feels like begging, and I hated myself for needing him. My chest ached with the weight of it, saved, yet powerless. I moved closer, my boots crunching over ash, and finally spoke. "You should rest. You bled for me." Thorne looked at me, his gaze steady, unflinching. "I bled for mercy, not for you alone." His voice cut deeper than any bullet. Because he was right. What I had mistaken for a rescue was something larger. He hadn't shielded just me, he had shielded a truth the town had buried. Mercy, memory, a refusal to let cruelty define the ledger. The silence between us thickened, heavy, intimate. I felt it press on my chest, the same way it had when he stepped between me and the lion. A silence that wasn't absence, but presence. That wordless connection bruised me with its honesty. He turned then, tightening the strap of his pack. Kalen leaned against his leg, the boy's eyes wide, unreadable. I saw it in that moment, his decision forming. He was preparing to leave. The realization hit me harder than fire, harder than laughter, harder than chains. The fear of abandonment returned, fierce and raw, a wound I thought I had numbed long ago. But wounds don't vanish. They wait. And this one opened with the ease of a scar split too many times. I remembered every departure I had ever endured. My father walking out before I knew how to count. Foster homes that packed me in a box and called it a transition. Friends who treated my silence as absence until they left without goodbye. To be left again was to be told once more that I was not worth the weight of staying. "Where will you go?" I asked, my voice thin, betraying more than I wanted. Thorne adjusted the strap, his eyes on the horizon. "Where I must." "And us?" I forced the word out, though my throat wanted to close. He glanced at me then, something unreadable flickering in his gaze. "You have breath. You have choice. You are not in a cage anymore." The words should have freed me. Instead, they terrified me, because choice without him felt like silence without echo, a road without a companion. And I didn't know if I was strong enough to walk it. The fire had ended the laughter, but it had also left me bare, stripped of excuses, no cage to blame, no crowd to point at. Just me, my scars, and the terrifying possibility that I had to decide what to do with freedom. Thorne's hand rested briefly on Kalen's shoulder. The boy leaned into the touch, trusting without question. And I realized I envied that trust. I craved it. I wanted to believe someone could stay, not because they had to, but because they chose to. He turned fully then, facing me, his expression carved from something older than anger, older than mercy. "If I walk away," he asked, voice low, steady, dangerous in its honesty, "will you follow?" The words cut into me like a blade, not of steel, but of truth. Because it wasn't about geography, it wasn't about a trail or a horizon, it was about loyalty, about memory, about the choice to step into connection after years of closing every door. If he walked away, would I follow? The question burned louder than the fire that had reduced Willow Pass to ash. The reckoning of mercy. What they mocked for mercy became worth more than their whole fairground. That was the thought burning in my chest as I stood in the same square where they had once thrown me into a lion's cage. The same square where Willow Pass had jeered, laughed, and spit on the sight of a man daring to hand bread to a starving child. The ashes of the menagerie still clung to the air. Black flakes floated down like dead snow, clinging to the shoulders of men who used to howl for blood. The ground smelled of soot and rust, the ghost of cruelty that refused to leave. In my hands were the papers, thin, crumpled, yet heavy as chains. Deeds, fines, writs of justice the sheriff had waved in my face. The documents that said my crime was feeding Kalen, that my punishment was entertainment for the crowd. They were not just paper, they were cages written in ink. I looked at them, then at the faces gathered before me. Hiram Vale, his showman's coat still singed from the fire, sneered with teeth yellowed by whiskey. "Go on," he called, his voice mocking shrill. "Play martyr, Boone. Tear the papers and see if the lions of Willow Pass forgive you." Beside him, Ezra Pike smirked, arms crossed, his eyes flicking from the crowd to me as if measuring which side would profit more. "This town thrives on laughter," he said, "and you're still the best joke it ever bought for $1. Their words cut, but not deep. Not anymore. Because standing in the square, I felt something shift. The laughter no longer owned me. The cage no longer defined me. I raised the papers, my hands shaking, not with fear, but with fury that had finally found its voice. "You want a show?" I said, my voice echoing through the hushed crowd. "Then watch." I tore the first page. The sound ripped through the square sharper than any gunshot. I tore another, and another. Each shred drifted to the ground like ash, falling among the soot of the menagerie. Each tear was louder than their mockery, louder than the roar of the lion they had thought would devour me. "These papers don't hold me," I said. My voice rose, raw, breaking but strong. "They don't hold him." I gestured to Kalen standing in the front row, eyes wide. "They don't hold anyone. They are lies dressed as law. They are cages built of signatures and seals, and I will not wear them anymore." The crowd shifted. Some lowered their eyes, shame gnawing at the edges of their pride. Others looked afraid, as if the tearing of paper might unravel the entire town's order. Hiram barked laughter, though it cracked halfway. "You think ripping parchment makes you free? Fool. Freedom," I said, my chest heaving, "isn't written, it's lived. And if mercy is my crime, then I'll hang for it before I let you call it weakness again." I threw the last shred into the air. The wind caught it, scattering it across the square like brittle leaves. The people watched the fragments scatter, and in their silence I knew something had broken. Not just the papers, but the story they had built around them. And all the while, Thorne Ashfall stood at the edge of the square. Silent, bleeding still, his arm bandaged in linen darkened by sacrifice. His eyes never left me. He said nothing, yet his presence was louder than my voice. A witness, a reminder, a measure of truth that needed no amplification. I felt it then, the truth that by tearing those papers I had freed myself as much as anyone. Not from chains, but from silence. Not from a lion, but from the smaller, quieter cages I had carried all my life. Shame, loneliness, abandonment. For years I had convinced myself I was powerless, that the world could take from me whatever it wanted and leave me breathing but empty. Tonight in the square where their laughter had once devoured me, I chose otherwise. Tonight I became the one to break the lock. The crowd did not cheer. They did not laugh. They simply watched, hushed, shaken. And in that silence I heard the roar of change begin. Ezra Pike spat into the dust, his smirk faltering. "You think the town will follow you? You're one man. One weak man with no roof left standing." "Maybe," I said. My voice softened but carried. "But I'd rather stand roofless in truth than live under a roof built of cages." And then, quiet. The kind of quiet that feels like a coin flipping in midair. Fate suspended, future uncertain. It was in that silence that Thorne finally spoke. His voice was low, steady, cutting through the square like the last line of a sermon the earth itself had been waiting to hear. "Freedom is not given," he murmured, his eyes on me, on the boy, on the town that had sold laughter as law. "It is taken." The words struck harder than gunfire. The square inhaled, waiting, trembling, as if the night itself had been thrown a question it could not yet answer. Would Willow Pass learn to live without cages or rebuild them out of fear? The chains that never clinked, the trail of quiet choices. The heaviest chains are the ones no one hears. They don't rattle, don't clang against iron bars, don't cut the wrists until they bleed. They're quieter, hidden, woven into the way a town teaches its children to laugh at cruelty, the way silence is mistaken for peace, the way mercy is branded weakness. Those were the chains I saw most clearly in Willow Pass after the fire, after the cage, after the tearing of paper that had once called itself law. But chains don't vanish because one man rips parchment in a square. They linger, they echo, and as the dust settled, the town split along those echoes. Half turned their eyes away, ashamed, remembering the howls they had thrown like stones when I was in the lion's den. The other half bristled, anger sharpened by fear, desperate to rebuild the story they had always known. That cruelty kept order, that silence kept safety. They looked at Thorne Ashfall and saw not the man who had shielded me from bullet and beast, but the reminder of a strength they could not buy, a memory they could not erase. Thorne said nothing. He didn't need to. His silence was heavier than their noise. He stood in the square only long enough to bandage his arm tighter, to scan the horizon, to breathe as though the air of Willow Pass itself carried the taste of departure. I followed his gaze and saw it, a trail barely visible in the dust, faint marks leading out toward the ridge. At first I thought it was just footsteps, but I realized he was making something more. Every shift of his heel, every deliberate drag in the earth was a mark, a path, a farewell carved not in words but in silence. My throat ached. I wanted to call out, to beg him to stay, to ask for more lessons, more presence, more of the unspoken connection that had tethered me to hope in ways I had never dared before. But the words tangled against my ribs, because deep down I knew allyship did not mean standing ahead of him, did not mean clinging. It meant standing back when the path belonged to him alone. Freedom, he had told me once, was not given. It was taken. And I was beginning to learn that freedom, real freedom, was not charity either. You could not hand it like bread across a table. You could not gift it like coin in a pocket. You could not save a person from chains that weren't yours to wear. You could only respect the silence of their scars and choose to walk beside them if they let you. That realization cut deep, heavier than any bullet, sharper than any lion's claw, because it meant I couldn't save Thorne. I couldn't keep him here, couldn't tie him down with gratitude or need. To do so would be to rebuild the very cage we had burned. The townsfolk lingered at the edges of the square, their faces pale in the fading firelight. Some muttered about rebuilding the menagerie, about rewriting the ledger. Others turned their backs as if ashamed of their own laughter. A woman at the diner door dropped her rag and stepped inside, shutting the lamp against the square as though she could close out memory with the turn of a lock. But me, I stayed, watching, waiting, breathing in the silence that roared louder than their old jeers. Thorne moved toward the edge of town, Kaelin at his side, still silent, still clutching the threadbare cloth I had once handed him as food, as mercy, as rebellion. The boy didn't look back. Children rarely do. They trust the step ahead more than the ground behind. I wanted to call Kaelin's name to remind him he wasn't alone anymore, but I realized that wasn't my right. The boy's silence wasn't mine to fill. It was his to carry until he chose otherwise. And maybe that was the hardest lesson. Learning that freedom wasn't about rushing to open someone else's cage, but about waiting until they placed the key in your hand. Thorne stopped at the ridge. The sun was bleeding into the horizon, gold streaking red, sky bent into the shape of a wound slowly closing. He looked back only once, and even then his eyes didn't ask me to follow. They asked me to remember. The dust at his boots lifted, catching the light, shaping itself into a sign, a faint swirl that faded almost as soon as it appeared. A trail marked by silence, by choice, by the absence of chains clinking. My chest tightened. My hands shook. Everything in me wanted to run, to follow, to refuse abandonment yet again. But my feet stayed planted, because for the first time I understood. To follow blindly would be to betray the very freedom he had bled to defend. So I stood there watching him fade into horizon, my heart pounding with grief and gratitude, loss and recognition. The trail was his. The choice was mine, and as his figure disappeared into the dying light, I heard his lesson echo one last time. Not in words, not in voice, but in the silence he left behind. Freedom is not charity, it is the courage to let go. The dust swirled once, then settled, and I was left in Willow Pass, staring at a trail only I could decide whether to take. The silence after laughter. The silence after laughter. When his footsteps faded, the silence roared louder than their howls ever did. It was a silence that clung to Willow Pass like ash to skin. A silence that no hammer could rebuild into cages, no coin could buy back into laughter. The square where they had once gathered to mock, to jeer, to feast on cruelty as if it were bread and ale, now sat hollow. The boards of the menagerie smoldered into blackened splinters. The torches that once lit justice gutters had burned out, and all that remained was memory. I stood in that silence, breathing it, tasting it, carrying it like a weight I had never asked for but could no longer live without. It wasn't emptiness, it wasn't peace. It was reckoning. Willow Pass would never be the same. The people knew it. I saw it in their eyes as they crept through streets now haunted by what they had done. No more laughter rang in the saloon when my name was mentioned. No more gossip spilled from Isolde Crane's lips without trembling. Even Sheriff Silas Crowder, who once spat law like scripture, now walked with a limp in his pride, his badge dull, his voice cracked. The fire had done more than devour cages. It had eaten the town's excuse for cruelty. It had burned the mask from their faces. And once laughter dies, it does not return the same. For me, the change cut deeper. I carried scars on my skin, yes, but also in my memory. Scars of chains I had worn long before Willow Pass decided to make a spectacle of me. Scars of silence from years when I thought loneliness was safer than connection, when I believed shame was survival. But Thorne Ashfall broke that lie. Not with sermons, not with speeches, with action. With blood spilled not in conquest but in mercy, with silence that spoke louder than a crowd's roar, with a gaze that told me the heaviest chains are the ones we accept and the only way to break them is to risk reaching beyond ourselves. Thorne did more than save my life. He saved my soul. He showed me that survival isn't the same as living, that endurance isn't the same as freedom. And in his leaving, he gave me the final lesson, that true freedom cannot be begged or bought or borrowed, it must be chosen. I think often of Kalen, the boy whose hunger started it all. I wonder what stories he'll carry, what scars will shape him, what silences he will learn to break. Maybe he will remember me as the man who dared to hand him bread in a town that called kindness a crime. Maybe he won't remember me at all. Either way, I hope the memory he carries most is Thorne's, the man who bled without fear, who shielded without hesitation, who walked into silence and left a trail no map could hold. As for me, I walk the streets of Willow Pass differently now, not proudly, not fearlessly, but awake. Every cracked sidewalk, every flickering lamp, every boarded stall reminds me of what was lost, but also of what was found. Mercy, resilience, the possibility of a second chance. I have nothing left. My home is ash. My name is still whispered with unease. My pockets are empty, my future uncertain. And yet, I carry a truth that no gold, no land, no applause could ever match. I lost everything, I whisper to myself as I stand in the empty square, but gained a truth no gold could buy. And that truth is this: mercy is rebellion. Silence can roar louder than howls, and cages are never eternal if someone dares to bleed against them. I remember the first night when they laughed as I lifted my hand with a single act of defiance. They thought laughter was power, that mockery was victory. But I have lived long enough to hear its ending. They laughed then. They are silent now.